Another popular animal product in South Africa is poultry meat. And now that $20 billion market is at the center of a trade disagreement with the U.S. The U.S. is warning South Africa that it could lose a lucrative trade deal if it doesn't open up that market.
Welcome back. The dispute between South Africa and the United States over chicken import duties continues to hang over South Africa's extended inclusion in the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. Two United States senators have threatened to try to block South Africa from the lucrative US-Africa trade agreement if the country doesn't lift import duties on cheaper cuts of chicken.
South Africa just sent a message Washington never saw coming. For years, U.S. chicken flooded African markets, undercutting local farmers and dominating shelves. But today, everything changed. In a stunning move, South Africa has officially blocked U.S. chicken imports, and the fallout is massive. American exporters are staring at a $450 million loss, while South African farmers are celebrating the biggest victory they've had in decades. This isn't just about chicken, it's about power, trade, and who controls the future of Africa's food economy. And the moment this decision hit the global market, analysts started calling it a wake-up call for the United States. Because if one African nation can break away from American agricultural dominance, more could follow. Stay with me, because what comes next might reshape global farming, global politics, and America's position in Africa forever. South Africa's bold decision to block U.S. chicken imports didn't just shake up the agricultural world, it sent shockwaves through global trade, Washington politics, and African economic strategy. This moment is more than a trade ban. It's a tectonic shift in how African nations see themselves, how much economic power they are willing to reclaim, and how the United States handles the reality of losing influence in markets it once dominated. To understand the depth of this story, we must go back to the roots of the chicken trade, the political tensions behind it, and the new wave of African economic independence rising across the continent. For decades, the U.S. has poured cheap chicken into African markets, especially leg quarters, wings, and cuts Americans consume far less. These exports were heavily subsidized, mass-produced, and priced so low that African farmers simply couldn't compete. In South Africa, this became a long-standing battle between local poultry producers and foreign exporters who had the advantage of scale, technology, and subsidized production. As a result, South African farmers often watched their costs rise while cheap imports flooded the shelves, limiting their ability to grow, invest, or dominate their own domestic market. But today, after years of pressure, negotiations, trade disputes, and economic modeling, South Africa finally said, enough. The government announced the immediate suspension of U.S. chicken imports, citing concerns about unfair pricing, economic strain on local farmers, and the need to protect national food security. This decision triggered celebrations among South African poultry associations, farmer unions, and agricultural stakeholders who have been arguing for years that foreign imports weaken local industries and trap countries' independency. For the United States, however, this wasn't just an agricultural setback. It was a multi-million-dollar blow to an industry that has relied heavily on export markets to absorb excess production. The loss of $450 million is not just a number, it represents supply chains disrupted, contracts terminated, farmers pushed into uncertainty, and shipping companies suddenly facing dead roots. It also reflects something much larger: America's slipping grip on African markets. This move didn't come out of nowhere. South Africa has been pushing hard to strengthen its agricultural sector. Government initiatives to boost local poultry production, increase farmer training, improve feed systems, and support smallholder farmers have been underway for years. The country knows the power of controlling its food supply. It understands that when local industries thrive, jobs multiply, economies stabilize, and food inflation becomes manageable. But foreign imports, especially cheap, subsidized ones, can crush this progress in an instant. So when the South African government finally pulled the trigger, it wasn't a rash decision. It was a strategic move, a reclaiming of economic power. And the timing couldn't be more symbolic. Across Africa, nations are rejecting economic patterns that once kept them dependent and vulnerable. Countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, and Ghana are implementing new policies that favor local production over foreign imports. The idea is simple: if Africa produces its own food, it keeps its money, controls prices, creates jobs, and builds industries that last generations. South Africa's move is part of that continental wave, but what makes this case different is the size of the impact. The U.S. didn't expect one of Africa's most advanced economies to cut off such a large trade channel so boldly. American officials have long assumed that African nations rely on U.S. imports for quality, affordability, and stability. That assumption has now been shattered. Washington reacted with concern. Analysts immediately warned that other African countries might follow South Africa's example. If that happens, the United States could lose billions across agriculture, technology, mining, and manufacturing exports, And beyond the financial losses, America risks something even more important: influence. The U.S. has long used trade relationships as a strategic tool, maintaining strong partnerships through agricultural exports, aid programs, and bilateral agreements. But when African nations begin to stand on their own economically, the power dynamic shifts dramatically, and that's what we're seeing now. South Africa's decision signals a new era, an era in which African countries set their own terms and challenge global economic giants without fear. It is a moment that tells the world Africa is no longer accepting low-value roles in global trade. It's telling the world that Africa can protect its markets, strengthen its farmers, and build its industries without bowing to foreign pressure. The financial losses for the U.S. are enormous, but the symbolic loss is even bigger. South Africa didn't just block chicken imports. It blocked the status quo. It raised a flag that says African markets belong to Africans, and this message is resonating far beyond agriculture. Meanwhile, South African farmers are experiencing something rare: a win. For years, they have pleaded for protection, warning that cheap imports make it impossible to scale production or compete. They argued that local farmers can produce enough chicken for the entire nation if given fair market conditions. Now, with U.S. imports temporarily off the shelves, South African producers have room to expand. They can increase capacity, hire workers, build new processing plants, and introduce new technologies. Local feed suppliers get more business. Transport companies move more goods. Rural communities that rely heavily on agriculture feel the economic boost immediately. This is why the push to block foreign imports wasn't just a nationalist move, it was a pro-development strategy. South Africa wants to create stronger, more resilient agricultural systems that don't collapse when global supply chains get disrupted, systems that don't depend on cheaper foreign products, systems that support local businesses from the ground up, and this policy does exactly that. Of course, the United States argues that South Africa's decision is protectionist and detrimental to global free trade. But South Africans counter with a simple truth: free trade is not free when powerful countries can subsidize their products while weaker economies cannot. Leveling the playing field sometimes requires protection. It requires strategic barriers that give local industries the space to grow before facing international competition. This situation highlights deeper issues in global economics, issues about fairness, power, and who benefits from global trade deals. It also highlights how African nations are tired of being the market rather than the manufacturer. They're tired of exporting raw materials while importing everything else at higher costs. They're tired of dependency cycles that keep wealth flowing outward. By blocking U.S. chicken imports, South Africa is taking one step toward breaking that pattern. But the story doesn't end with economics. There are political layers intertwined with this decision. South Africa has been strengthening its ties with BRICS nations: China, Russia, India, Brazil, and pushing for more global multipolarity. The U.S. sees this as a challenge to its traditional influence. Now, with a decision that directly hits American business interests, political commentators argue that South Africa is leaning even further into independence and alternative alliances. The U.S. knows losing economic ground often leads to losing political leverage. That's why this $450 million loss feels much larger. It's a warning sign. It tells Washington that African countries are no longer predictable markets. They are no longer obliged to follow Western economic direction. They are starting to play by their own rules. Meanwhile, on the ground in South Africa, consumers are reacting in mixed ways. Some worry that removing imports may raise prices temporarily. Others welcome the move, saying it's better to pay a little more for food produced locally, benefiting their own economy rather than enriching foreign corporations. Many point to the long-term benefits: more local jobs, stronger domestic competition, and better food security as local production expands. And local companies are already reacting. Major South African poultry firms are increasing production, hiring new workers, and fast-tracking expansion projects previously considered too risky because of foreign competition. Smallholder farmers, often ignored, are suddenly included in new supply chains designed to meet growing demand. The government is investing in training programs, disease prevention, and new hatcheries. Investments are flowing in. The industry is transforming practically overnight. If South Africa maintains this policy for even a year, the long-term effects could be dramatic. The local poultry sector could become one of the strongest on the continent, serving not only domestic consumers but also regional export markets in southern Africa. Several African nations in SADC already rely on South African agricultural products. A stronger poultry industry could anchor a regional supply chain, making South Africa a key poultry exporter instead of an importer. For the United States, the fear is that other countries might replicate this model. Kenya could block American maize. Nigeria could block U.S. wheat. Ghana could block American frozen foods. Once African nations realize they can take back control and benefit from doing so, the domino effect could be unstoppable. That's why analysts say this is more than a trade issue, it's a geopolitical shift. South Africa took a step that many nations are afraid to take publicly. It challenged a global superpower on an economic front, and it did so with confidence. This entire situation reflects a deep truth emerging across the continent. Africa is no longer content with being a passive player in global trade. It wants to be a producer, exporter, and decision maker. It wants to retain the value of its own markets and resources. It wants to create industries that last generations, not economies that depend on foreign leftovers. The United States now faces a dilemma. Retaliation risks pushing South Africa further away and damaging political relations, but acceptance means acknowledging a decline in influence. Washington will have to decide how to respond in a world where African countries no longer bow to economic pressure. Regardless of what comes next, the world is watching South Africa closely, and African leaders are watching even more closely. If South Africa's economy strengthens, if local farmers thrive, if the poultry industry expands, and if food prices stabilize, other nations will be inspired to follow. This one decision could reshape the future of African agriculture, trade, and industry for decades. The message is clear. Africa is rising. Africa is choosing itself. Africa is defending its markets, and for the first time in a long time, the world is being forced to take notice. South Africa blocking U.S. chicken imports isn't just a trade story, it's a story of sovereignty, courage, and economic transformation. It's a moment that shows Africa is stepping into a new era. An era where global giants don't automatically win. An era where African farmers have power. An era where African governments put local industries first. An era where billions of dollars no longer leave the continent unnoticed. This story is not just about chicken, it's about identity, it's about strategy, it's about power, it's about Africa reshaping its place in the global economy. And whether the world is ready or not, this shift is happening right now. And as this story unfolds, one thing becomes clear: what South Africa has done is bigger than policy, bigger than trade, bigger than a dispute over chicken. It is a declaration that African nations are no longer waiting for permission to decide their own futures. It's a quiet but powerful reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary moments don't come from war or protests or political speeches. They come from decisions made in boardrooms, in parliament halls, and in ministries where leaders finally choose courage over pressure, dignity over dependency, and long-term prosperity over short-term convenience. For too long, African farmers have been told to accept defeat before even stepping onto the field. They've been told that global giants are too big, too efficient, too powerful to compete with. They've even told that the world market dictates their destiny, that their hard work will always be overshadowed by foreign producers who have more land, more machines, more subsidies, and more influence. But now, for the first time, they are seeing what it feels like to be backed by their own government, protected by their own policies, and supported by their own people. And that changes everything. Imagine the young farmer in Eastern Cape who has been raising chickens on a small plot for years, never believing his business could grow, because imported chicken always sold cheaper. Imagine the father in KwaZulu-Natal who wanted to expand his poultry farm but couldn't de-risk the investment because foreign products pushed prices down unpredictably. Imagine the rural communities that depended on agriculture but watched opportunity slip away because the market was stacked against them. Today, those people feel hope, real hope, hope that their work matters. Hope that they will finally be able to compete on equal ground. Hope that they can build businesses that last, that hire workers, that lift families out of poverty, and that contribute to the economy. This is the emotional heartbeat of South Africa's decision. Behind the numbers, behind the politics, behind the headlines, there are real people whose lives could change dramatically because of one courageous move. And that is why this story resonates so deeply. It touches identity. It touches pride. It touches the belief that African nations deserve to be more than consumers of foreign goods. They deserve to be producers of their own prosperity. But there's also another side to this. This decision has reminded the world that Africa cannot be underestimated. For decades, global powers saw the continent as a place to sell to, extract from, and influence. They never imagined a moment when African countries would confidently push back. Yet here we are. South Africa's choice sends a message far beyond poultry. It tells the world that Africa is paying attention, that Africa is thinking strategically, and that Africa is ready to defend its economic future. And maybe that's what stings the most for the US. It's not just the $450 million loss. It's the realization that the world as they knew it is changing, that the nations they once assumed were dependent are becoming independent, assertive, and self-driven. As more African countries watch what South Africa has done, they will be inspired to take similar steps, and every step shifts the global balance just a little more. But as we close this story, let's zoom out and remember something bigger. This isn't a story about America losing, it's a story about Africa winning. It's a story about a continent choosing to stand tall. It's a story about farmers who finally feel seen. It's a story about a government that dared to put its people first. And it's a story about the beginning of a new era where African nations build industries that feed themselves, enrich themselves, and empower themselves. Because at the end of the day, true independence doesn't come from flags or speeches. It comes from the ability to feed yourself, to produce what you consume, and to control the markets that shape your daily life. South Africa's decision is one step on that journey, but it is an important step, a brave step, a step that future generations will look back on as the moment when things started to change. And as the world watches, one thing is certain: Africa is rising, Africa is awakening, Africa is choosing itself. And no matter who is shocked, frustrated, or unprepared for this shift, the momentum cannot be stopped.